Hello. Well, as we finish this 11th week of the book of Acts, we finish up Acts chapter 3, and I thought I'd look at some commentary points of interest. I don't think I have any major breakthroughs, here that I haven't already shared a little bit in the day-to-day Greek. And by the way, weigh in on my thought about moving a little bit more speedily and less analytically through the Greek. These two places in Acts chapter 3 where the Greek word pais is used for servant/son, I'm pretty convinced that Luke wants us to think of Isaiah 53. And of course, as I say down here, Isaiah 53 plays an explicit role in Acts' theology when we get to Acts chapter 8. The Ethiopian eunuch, as you know, is reading from Acts 53 and is confused. Who is this talking about? And by the way, from an inductive Bible study perspective, I understand the Ethiopian eunuch's pain because the chapters leading up to Isaiah 53 are clearly about Israel. Israel is the servant. And yet when we get to Isaiah 53, the servant is suffering for Israel. And so you can see where, wait a minute. If the servant is Israel, then how can Israel suffer for Israel? Is the servant, as the eunuch says, is the prophet talking about himself or someone else? Is Isaiah suffering for Israel? What's going on here? And you have to wonder if this is part of the, I don't think I've said this in any of my videos, but I sometimes wonder if God has made Old Testament prophecy a little like those 3D things, where in order to see the 3D thing, you have to kind of look beyond the page, and then it kind of comes out into 3D, as if, there's something, like from an Old Testament Jewish perspective, there's something hinky about Isaiah 53. I can kind of see what it looks like, but it's like there's some funny going on here. So it's not until we put on our Jesus 3D glasses, that, oh, okay, this makes perfect sense, in relation to Jesus. Now, I put the quotes here that the Ethiopian eunuch is reading from. He was led as a sheep to the slaughter, as a lamb before his shearer is silent, he did not open his mouth. In humiliation, his judgment was taken away. Who will relate his generation? For his life was removed from the earth. Interesting. It's interesting that at least in Acts 8, Luke does not focus on he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. And I haven't done a thorough study on this. Probably somebody has. But Luke is not particularly known for his substitutionary atonement. That's not really Luke's focus. In fact, where Mark says the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many, Luke's version of that takes out the ransom part, if I remember correctly. Basically, what I'm getting at is, even though it seems pretty clear to me that Luke is equating Jesus with the suffering servant of Isaiah 53, I don't feel like I know enough to say exactly what aspect of Isaiah 53 Luke is focusing on. So there's something for further study. I'm sure there are books that have been written on it. Acts is not my primary point of expertise, so I've not read every monograph on Acts for sure. But a point of interest and possible further study. Prophet like Moses, Deuteronomy 18:15. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. And of course, we know that this, at least from a New Testament perspective, from the standpoint of Acts 3, and from the standpoint of John, I believe, this is referring to Jesus. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, this is indeed the prophet who was to come into the world. The crowds, at least, twice in John, the crowds wonder if Jesus is a prophet like Moses. And I think that John wants us to think of Jesus as a prophet like Moses. Funny thing about John is, though, and here's the argument on the other side, is that, or I guess they're asking about John the Baptist, aren't they? When they say, are you the prophet? And John says he's not. So John, I'm pretty confident that John is equating Jesus with the prophet of Deuteronomy 18. In fact, I probably shouldn't have any doubt at all. Let me just mention a trivial pursuit, stuff that probably isn't important to life, but since I know it, it came to mind, and you might be interested. So there is a thesis that in the original understanding, or in a early understanding of Israel, Josiah was taken to be this prophet like Moses. You can notice that when was the book of the law discovered in the temple? The book of the law was discovered in the temple when Josiah was king. I think most scholars would say that when Joshua refers to the book of the law, or when 2 Kings refers to the book of the law, it's referring to the book of Deuteronomy. Later on in like Ezra and in those post-exilic writings, it talks about the book of Moses, and that probably refers to Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. But I think most scholars would say that when Joshua refers to the book of the law, it's referring to Deuteronomy, and that the book of the law that is found in 2 Kings is the book of Deuteronomy. And so it is interesting. I don't know if you've ever noticed how exalted a figure Josiah is. Before Josiah, there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart, with all his soul, with all his mind, according to all the law of Moses, nor did any like him arise after him. And so it's very interesting. David is not the hero of 2 Kings, or of what we might call, it's sometimes called the Deuteronomistic history. Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings are sometimes called the Deuteronomistic history because Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings tell the story of Israel from a Deuteronomistic perspective, that is, from the perspective of the book of Deuteronomy. And so it's sometimes thought that before, again, we're getting into a little bit of speculation that you can throw out the window, but that before you had Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, you had Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. And so according to 2 Kings, Josiah is even more significant than David as a king. And here in 1 Kings, a son shall be born to the house of David, Josiah by name, and he shall sacrifice on you, on this altar, the priests of the high places who offer incense on you, and human bones will be burned on you. And so, again, I don't know if you've ever noticed, but Josiah is the bomb in the book of Kings. Of course, 1 and 2 Kings were just one book in Hebrew, Kings. And then when it was translated into Greek and they put the vowels in, they had to use 2 scrolls, 1 and 2 Kings. But before the vowels were added and we were in Hebrew, 1 scroll, book of Kings. Okay. All the prophets from Samuel have predicted these days. I was reading a little in Keener about this because, the question is, well, when did Samuel prophesy about Jesus? Where do we find that? And of course, Keener comes up with some suggestions. For example, the fact that Samuel he crowned David king. There will never cease to be a king, from the throne, whatever. So some wonder if the kind of predictions of Samuel about the monarchy of David are what Acts has in mind, or Peter has in Acts has in mind. Keener does mention that in Acts, all doesn't necessarily mean every last one, and he quotes Josephus. Josephus is a historian in the late 1st century, and Josephus basically says everybody ran away. No, everybody obeyed. There were 50 who hid behind. So all the prophets doesn't necessarily mean, including Nahum. I mean, you know what I mean. All did not necessarily mean all in the way they talk. And we do this today. When I said everybody loved it, what about John? Okay, John didn't like it. You know what I'm saying? So it's a kind of a colloquial way of speaking. However, I do have a theory. I'm sure somebody suggested this because everybody suggested everything. We've been writing commentaries for 100 and some years. But here's my suggestion. My hypothesis is that Luke and Peter and Luke are not so much referring to Samuel the person, but to the book of Samuel. So in Hebrew, First and Second Samuel are the book of Shemuel. And so that I think it's talking about the book of Samuel. Now, alternatively, it is Jewish tradition that Samuel wrote the book of Samuel with some help from Nathan and Gad, the prophets. So if that tradition was in place at the time of Luke, it may be that Luke was thinking that Samuel wrote Samuel. But it could just be as simple as the book of Samuel predicts this. And let me give you an example of a scripture from 2 Samuel that the book of Hebrews takes in a spiritual sense to be about Jesus. I will be to him a father, and he will be to me a son. Although in its original context, this is David talking to God about Solomon. And God says, Solomon will be my son, I'll be his father. The book of Hebrews takes this in a sensus plenior, in a fuller sense, in relation to Jesus in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 5, I think it is. So this is another possibility for the scripture that Peter in Acts 3 has in mind. Well, there's some comments for your thoughts. I don't have the answers, but it's fun thinking about these things, at least for me. Well, have a great day. And I'm going to start next week I'm going to do an interlinear, unless you protest. Hey, you're paying for this, so feel free to protest. You five have more say than anybody in the world, I guess, except for me maybe. Okay, but so I'm going to do an interlinear of about 5 verses a day. I'm not going to do the parsing. I'm not going to do the pronouncing of the words. I'm just going to basically show how to translate and do a little ad hoc. But I'll cover a little bit more scripture, 5 or 6 verses a day. We'll see how it goes. Maybe I'll just do it for a week, and then you all say, stop doing that. But have a great week.